The History of the Old Brick Church podcast is brought to you by St. Luke's Historic Church and Museum, located in Smithfield, Virginia. As a museum and historic site, St. Luke's focuses on the development of religious freedom and the early American religious experience. This program was supported by a grant from Virginia Humanities.
And welcome back, everybody, to another episode of History from the Old Brick Church podcast, a podcast of St. Luke's Historic Church and Museum, a museum of the oldest church building in Virginia. And we are so grateful to have with us today Jamie Helmick from Jamestown Settlement. She is the Special Projects and Program Manager for JYF, and we're so grateful that you can be with us to talk about another kind of undertold narrative, the role of women in the colony of Virginia and specifically at Jamestown. But before we get into that, Jamie, we always like to ask our guests, what was it that first inspired you to study history in the first place?
Well, that's kind of an interesting story. I grew up in a Navy family, which meant that we moved around quite a bit. And just the fact that we got to see a lot of the world really started getting me interested in learning more about it and all the different kinds of people that live in it. And my own family background also kind of contributed to my interest in history. My mother is Native and my father is of European descent. So learning about both of those cultures and their historical interactions and their influences was just always very fascinating to me growing up.
Fantastic. So we want to talk a little bit about the role of women at Jamestown and their relationship to the established Church of England that came to play in the early part of the 17th century. But it seems like because of commemorations a couple of years ago, that in people's mindsets, that the colony was largely male-dominated in the earlier years. But there were women present in the colony from England and perhaps elsewhere in early Jamestown. So talk to us a little bit about that.
Oh, yes, definitely. Yeah, there were definitely women here before those 1619 women arrived. The first two women actually arrived in the fall of 1608. So the men are here for a little over a year, by themselves building the colony before the first two women come over. And those were Mistress Forrest and her maid Anne Burris. And, the first women that come over were likely married to or working for some of the men who were here. So they're gonna trickle in a little bit in the early years that way. We know that in 1609, a large resupply is sent over to the colony that had about 9 ships in it, and 5 of those ships contained women and children. So there were probably over 100 women and children coming over on those ships. And that is part of the voyage. If you're familiar with the story of the Sea Venture, which is the ship that shipwrecked on Bermuda for 10 months. Some of the women were involved in that ship as well. So some of them end up here in Virginia. Some of them end up shipwrecked on Bermuda for a little while before they build new ships and continue on to Virginia. And a few, trickle in during the martial law period, but because the restrictions were kind of severe while they're in a period of warfare with the Powhatan, not as many women are coming over during those years until you get into the 16 teens. We know that in 1618, there was even a ship of women prisoners who were sent over. They were mostly vagrants who were sent because the prisons were getting overcrowded. But there was kind of a wide variety of women coming over before that first organized attempt to bring over a large group of single women happened.
It's been an extraordinarily arduous journey for children to be on. Hard enough for adults, right?
Yeah, definitely. It had to be scary leaving home at that time period, for sure.
Imagine so. So amongst those early women at Jamestown, there was a discovery some years ago of an unidentified woman. Her remains were found, and she is known simply as Jane. That's a pretty startling story. Tell us a little bit about what we know about Jane.
Oh, definitely. So Jane's remains were found kind of amidst a collection of animal bones at the original fort site next door to our museum, Historic Jamestown. Her remains showed signs of having been butchered, which kind of validated some of the primary source stories of cannibalism that happened during the period called the Starving Time. So, after that big supply of women and children come over, they enter into a period of warfare with the Powhatan, and we call that winter the starving time. We know that Jane had passed away before she was cannibalized. So she, had signs of those butcher marks and likely was cannibalized. But that does show the harsh brutality of the conditions the English experienced during that winter when the Powhatan had laid siege to the fort. So the fort at that time, because they had just gotten all those new colonists in, the fort was overcrowded. The supplies ran out quickly. They're unable to leave the fort and forage. So conditions get really bad. We have some primary quotes that indicate that they dug up dead bodies out of their graves and ate them. They licked up the blood that had fallen from weakened foes. And there's one account of a man who purposely killed and salted his wife and ate her. So we know that there were some very drastic, conditions going on at the time. And unfortunately, Jane was not necessarily a victim because she had passed away already, but she was involved in that tragedy. We know very little about who she actually was. So Jane is a name we just gave her because of Jane Doe, basically. But other than that, we don't know anything about her life. We don't know what station of woman she was. We know that her rough age was around 14. But we don't know her real name. And we really don't end up knowing the names of most of the women that ended up here in Virginia that died before the 1620s, because that's when censuses began to be taken, and that's when actual names get recorded.
I remember hearing Bly Straub talk about Jane and the fact that they did give her a name to kind of affirm her humanity, which I thought was really a lovely thing to do.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, I mean, anything you can do to humanize these stories and make them, an experiencer where you can really picture it and realize that these are real people that it happened to is great.
Not a romantic picture that many people might have of early colonial life. I always get a kick out of people who say, I wish I could have lived back then. And my response is, no, you don't.
Yeah, definitely. That's usually my response too.
So given how difficult the conditions were here, it's quite remarkable even that the colony survived. But what would inspire a woman of the early 17th century to make this dangerous voyage and to live in a place that had so many difficulties from the start?
Well, as you probably know, Jamestown is founded as a money-making venture. So when it was first founded, their main goal was to find a way to make money. And they tested a lot of possible ways to make money. And eventually they found out that the best way to do it, the best way to make a profit is just take advantage of the vast amounts of land in Virginia to grow tobacco. And you really can't settle and, create farms and grow tobacco and make a life without women. So no matter, what period stereotypes are, some people would say that women are physically weaker, they're spiritually more frail, but they do provide the domestic arts and they're necessary to build homes and start families. The lack of women in the fort in the early years was also something that the Powhatan people sought to take advantage of as well. There's evidence in the early years that Native women likely lived in the fort or at least stayed for extended periods in the first couple of years. And this was probably a strategic move by Powhatan, taking advantage of what he saw as a weakness living without women. And Native women would be able to create some alliances and, in his mind, help incorporate the English into his chiefdom. For the English women that come over, it's a chance at a better life. The women that they're requesting be sent over are women they describe as of low means and high character. So those who have a proven moral code, they're required to give letters of reference that say they're women of high morals, but who are looking at opportunities for a better life. There is some overcrowding, especially in the cities in England, and there's not a lot of ways to move up in your station back home in England. So just the potential for being able to move to Virginia and potentially marry a landowner and have an opportunity to a better life would usually be the reason they decide to come over here.